The lobby of the Harrisburg Federal Courthouse hums with a quiet choreography each morning. Stainless steel benches, the faint scuff of polished shoes, and the low murmur of elevator doors opening and closing. It is a place of routines, of order. People don't rush here. They arrive early. They carry briefcases, not noise. They speak with clipped syllables that say, "I belong." At 8:04 a.m., Angela Morris stepped into this rhythm like she had for years. Her coat hung smooth over her forearm, her hair pulled back into a tight natural twist, silver-rimmed glasses resting firmly on a face trained never to flinch. She looked on the surface like any other professional arriving for the business of law. And yet, this morning, everything faltered. 2 new security guards manned the checkpoint. One young, buzz-cut, and square-jawed, the other older, but unfamiliar. To her, they were rotating in from a different courthouse for cross-training. Angela knew how that worked. She once helped authorize the pilot program for court security protocols. But this morning, they didn't know her. More importantly, they didn't recognize her. Not as a colleague. Not as someone above them in authority. Not even as someone who had a right to stand there in front of that scanner just trying to get to her courtroom. They looked at her and saw a black woman, middle-aged, alone. No badge displayed. No smile that said, "Don't worry, I'm one of the good ones." She stepped forward. The scanner beeped once. A soft, undecided tone. She paused. "Ma'am," the younger guard said, hand already drifting toward his belt. "I need you to step aside." Angela blinked once. Not slow, not startled, just tired. A kind of weariness too old to show in the shoulders, but always there in the breath. She shifted her bag slightly and nodded. "Is there a problem?" The older guard, tall and stiff in posture, cleared his throat. "Just a routine bag check, nothing to worry about." But there was always something to worry about, wasn't there? She had passed through that security checkpoint 100 times. Her ID was linked to the personnel roster, her fingerprint registered with federal clearance. Her courtroom robe was hanging in Chamber 4C. And yet, here they were, pulling her aside while the man behind her, younger, white, wearing earbuds and sipping iced coffee, breezed through without pause. Angela handed over her bag. She didn't protest, didn't raise her voice. She simply watched as the guards opened the leather case, rifled past legal briefs, and unzipped the side pouch with her phone and charger. In silence, she waited. This was not the first time she'd been treated, like a question mark. Not the first time suspicion had curled around her without invitation. But there's a special kind of insult when you're mistaken for a threat in the very building where you keep the law upright. Behind her, footsteps echoed. A woman's voice approaching, familiar. "Judge Morris, so sorry, those are new hires." Angela turned her head slowly. Carla, the front desk administrator, looked mortified. Her hands fluttered in the air like she could somehow wave away the last 3 minutes. The guard stiffened. One of them muttered, "She's the judge?" The other cleared his throat again, now facing anywhere but Angela's eyes. But Angela didn't say a word. She took her bag, nodded once, and walked through the checkpoint. No grand rebuke, no angry confrontation, just that pause. The weight of it hanging behind her as she moved forward, one foot after the other, toward a courtroom waiting for her gavel. Because the problem was never the bag. The problem was never the scanner. The problem was what they didn't see when they looked at her. Angela Morris stood still, her posture measured, not defiant, not submissive, simply calibrated. Her body knew this stance. It had worn it for years. The invisible armor of presence, posture, poise. She didn't twitch, didn't blink. Her silence wasn't absence, it was pressure, the kind that makes men adjust their collars. Across from her, the younger guard had a checklist in his hand and suspicion in his eyes. His uniform was neat, his shoes polished, but he held the kind of authority that came only from proximity to a weapon, not from any sense of internal gravity. "We're going to need to ask you a few questions, ma'am," he said. The words weren't inherently wrong, but the tone was. It wasn't a request, it was a claim. Angela nodded slowly. "You're doing your job," she said. Not because she believed it, but because she wanted to hear how those words tasted in the air. "Is there a reason your ID isn't displayed?" he asked. She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew her credentials. Judge Angela Morris, United States District Court, Middle District of Pennsylvania. She handed it over without commentary. He held it like it might be fake. Behind her, another federal employee stepped through security. A man, older, white, wearing a courthouse visitor lanyard. No one asked for his ID. No one questioned where he was going. No one even slowed him down. Angela noticed. Of course she did. But she didn't flinch. She simply watched the young guard's fingers tighten on her badge. "I'll need to verify this," he said, and turned toward the desk. The older guard leaned in then, voice lower, more cautious. "Can I ask what you're here for today?" Angela met his eyes. "I'm presiding over the Wright sentencing. Courtroom 4C. He blinked. Twice. The name landed like a dropped gavel. Wright. A high-profile federal case, national press attention. Angela's name had been listed in every press release for the past 2 weeks. Still, he didn't move. Angela watched the discomfort settle on his face. She knew it well. The kind of shame that hadn't figured itself out yet. The kind that still thought maybe it was justified. "You understand?" he began. "We're just trying to ensure—" "I understand," Angela said, cutting gently. "Through his sentence, that your scanner cleared me and your system has my clearance on file. I also understand that I'm standing here while others walk through with full thermoses and backpacks." That did it. Not the words, but the evenness of them. That tone that judges use when they're stating a fact so undeniable. Even the room goes still. The younger guard returned, Carla following close behind. She looked like she had jogged the whole length of the hallway. "Judge Morris, I am so sorry," she said, voice rising in that awkward panic of public embarrassment. They're new. They didn't know. Angela took back her badge. She did not smile. She did not say, "It's all right," because it wasn't. The guards shifted on their feet. Carla glanced between them and Angela like she wished one of them would apologize. None of them did. Instead, Angela said softly, "To no one. In particular, I don't need to be known. I just need to be respected." Carla nodded quickly, as if that absolved everyone. Angela stepped forward through the final gate and entered the secure hallway that led to the elevators. Her heels tapped gently against the tile. But in her head, there was no sound, just the echo of the moment, that space between being called ma'am and being named judge. It wasn't the check. It wasn't the ID. It was the premise that her presence required suspicion, that her silence made her suspicious, that her skin, her stillness, her face not being familiar enough made her worth slowing down. Angela reached the elevator, pressed the button, and stood quietly. Inside, her phone buzzed. A message from her law clerk. Defense filed a new motion. "Are we still on for 9:30? She typed back, "Yes. Let's remind them what due process looks like." The doors opened. Behind her, the metal detector beeped again, but it wasn't for her. Angela Morris didn't need to announce herself. Her name was already inked on the docket, engraved on the door plate, and filed in every motion scheduled that day. But in moments like this, moments when she was reduced to a suspicion before she could be seen as a presence, she remembered that names didn't always move people. Faces did. And hers today hadn't matched the one they expected to see in power. She entered her chambers in silence. The courtroom staff was already prepping, law clerks reviewing case notes, a stenographer checking equipment, a marshal coordinating witness entry. Each of them greeted her with the calm cadence reserved for routine. But inside Angela, the routine had already cracked. She set her bag down beside the desk, smoothed the lapel of her blazer, and sat. The judicial robe, black, folded, reverent, lay across the back of her chair like a second skin she hadn't put on yet. Carla knocked gently and stepped inside. "They know now," she said quietly. "The guards." I explained everything. Angela looked up. "What did you explain?" Carla hesitated. "That you're the presiding judge, that it was a mistake." Angela didn't smile. "It wasn't a mistake." Carla stiffened, then tried to backpedal. "I mean, it was a misunderstanding." "No," Angela said softly. "It was a presumption." There was a long pause. Carla's eyes dropped. She nodded almost to herself and backed out of the room without another word. Angela turned back to the docket. The right sentencing. The defendant had pled guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud, a financial crime with victims spanning several states. The prosecution was asking for the maximum. The defense had filed for leniency based on cooperation. It was a big case, not because of the charge, but because of the symbolism. A case like this showed whether the justice system could hold high-ranking people accountable, and it was her courtroom, her decision. But before she could wear that robe, today, before she could gavel in justice, she'd been mistaken for a risk, for a disruption, for someone out of place. Her phone lit up with a message from Marshal Diaz, the head of courthouse security. "Judge Morris, my apologies. We're reviewing protocol. I'll speak with the team personally." Angela didn't respond. Because what could she say? That she appreciated the gesture? That it was enough? It wasn't. Not because she needed vengeance, but because she needed people to understand. Her authority wasn't a costume. It wasn't something she put on in chambers. It existed even in the security line, even without her badge, even in silence. But they hadn't seen it. Not until it was too late. At 9:25 a.m., Angela emerged in full judicial attire, robe draped over her shoulders, expression composed but not cold. She entered the courtroom and everyone rose, not out of fear but respect, because now they knew who she was. The guards were not in sight. A different marshal stood at the door. Angela took her seat. The courtroom settled. The first motion was addressed swiftly. The defense's request for sentence reduction was reviewed on the record. Angela listened, head slightly tilted, brow furrowed in a way that told every attorney she was storing everything they said. But beneath that stillness, another current ran. She saw it in the gallery, one of the guards from earlier standing in the back, watching. He had no assignment there. Perhaps curiosity had pulled him in, or maybe guilt. Angela met his eyes, just briefly, long enough for him to look down at his shoes. Power, real power, is often silent. It doesn't need to command a room with force. It waits until the room realizes it has entered. Angela turned to the defendant. She read the sentencing decision slowly, carefully, citing statutes, precedent, and the victim impact statements with unwavering clarity. Her voice never rose, but when she finished, the room was still. Sentence imposed. Court adjourned. Gavel fell, and as she stood to leave, every eye followed her, not because of her robe or her ruling, but because of the presence they had failed to recognize earlier that morning. In the hallway afterward, she moved toward her. Chambers without hurry. The guard, the young one, was waiting by the corner, unassigned, clearly uncomfortable. He stepped forward. "Judge Morris," she stopped. "I just wanted to apologize for earlier." Angela nodded once. "I appreciate that," she said. "I didn't know who you were," he added, trying to explain what couldn't be explained. That's the point, she replied. You didn't need to know who I was to treat me with respect. He swallowed hard. I understand. I hope you do, she said gently. Because next time it might not be a judge. It might be someone with no robe, no badge, just dignity. And they deserve it too. He nodded, a little too fast. Angela turned and walked on. She didn't need his redemption. She wasn't waiting for it. She had a docket to clear, a courtroom to return to, and an entire system watching her, finally, like she belonged. Angela Morris returned to chambers. The room was quiet. Not still, there's a difference, but quiet in the way old rooms are when their silence isn't emptiness, but memory. She unfastened the robe and folded it over the back of her chair with care. Her clerk entered briefly, gave a small update on the next day's docket, then paused. You handled that well, he said, voice cautious. Angela looked up. You mean the case? I mean the morning, he said. She nodded once and said nothing. Because, how do you measure whether you handled it well when what you were handling wasn't just about you? This wasn't the first time she had been mistaken for someone less than she was. It wasn't even the first time inside a courthouse. Years earlier, as a young public defender, she'd been barred from entering the witness room by a bailiff who assumed she was a client's girlfriend. She hadn't said anything back then. Just waited until the supervising attorney corrected the man. The apology never came. Later, as a rising assistant district attorney, she had been overlooked at her own swearing in. The officer introducing new staff had skipped her name entirely. When someone pointed it out, he'd said, "Oh, I thought she was just shadowing." Angela had stopped keeping track of the moments, but they hadn't stopped happening. It wasn't about badges or titles. It was about the shape of the presumption. In every institution she'd entered, law school, state bar meetings, judicial panels, she noticed the same glance. The moment of mental adjustment people had to make when they realized she wasn't who they thought she was. That pause where their expectation ran face first into reality. Some people adjusted, some doubled down. And in courtrooms, that difference meant everything. After the day's hearings ended, Angela met with Marshal Diaz. He brought printouts, incident, summaries, security logs, statements from both guards. One had admitted he didn't think judges entered through the public entrance. The other said he felt unsure because she didn't announce her role immediately. Angela raised an eyebrow. Since when is that a requirement? Diaz didn't answer. Instead, he looked tired. Not defensive, just old with it. Like someone who'd carried more apologies than corrections. We're expanding unconscious bias training, he said. We've already scheduled another round for all external support officers. We'll rebrief the entire weekend rotation team. Angela waited. She knew this dance. She respected its steps, but she also knew what it left out. Marshal, she said, voice low, this isn't about one checkpoint, or even two officers. This is about the culture that trained them to see me as suspect. He looked at her then. Really looked. Not like a subordinate addressing a superior, but like a man being handed the weight of something sacred. I know, he said. No, she corrected. You're beginning to know. That's not the same. In the weeks that followed, she noticed small changes, not immediate, not dramatic, but subtle. New officers greeted her by name. A shift supervisor asked for feedback on updated entry procedures. Training brochures now included a segment titled Visual Bias, Who We Think Looks Like Authority. Angela saw her own story on page 3. Anonymized but unmistakably hers. That mattered. Not because she needed her pain validated, but because it had entered the bloodstream of the building. It could no longer be dismissed as a one-time event. Institutional change is never loud. It doesn't shout, it accumulates. Angela saw it in the way people hesitated, just briefly, before assuming now. That pause, once so painful when aimed at her, now had the power to protect others. That was worth something. Still, she remembered. She remembered the security guard who had watched her that day with a mixture of doubt and discomfort. She remembered the clerk who had tried to soften the edges of the moment with an apology that was too thin for the shape of the wound. She remembered the officer who said she didn't look like a judge. And she remembered her own stillness in that moment, not because she lacked fury, but because she carried something heavier than anger, clarity, the clarity that the system hadn't failed. It had functioned exactly the way it was built to function, recognizing power not by merit, but by silhouette, not by training, but by familiarity, not by respect, but by assumption. The system didn't forget who she was. It never knew her to begin with. And now, it had to learn. One courtroom at a time. Angela. Morris didn't want an apology. She wanted the apology to become obsolete. In the aftermath of the incident, there were emails, meetings, check-ins, people asking how she felt, whether she'd like to speak to the officers directly, whether she intended to file a formal complaint. She answered with restraint and one condition: let's do something that lasts longer than this week's regret. The courthouse's chief judge invited her to a private lunch. The meal was served in silence for the first few minutes. Grilled chicken, too crisp, and lemon water that tasted like it had been waiting in a refrigerator full of old files. He cleared his throat. I read your statement. You wrote it very precisely. Angela nodded. Clarity matters. He offered a stiff smile. We've all made assumptions. Even me. She didn't offer comfort. That wasn't what he needed. Instead, she handed him a printed proposal, 3 pages, single-spaced. Her suggestions were detailed but not difficult. Visual bias awareness training for all courthouse staff, not just security, anonymous incident reporting mechanism for microaggressions, accessible to staff and visitors alike. Annual equity audit, external, not internal, promotion of underrepresented candidates into visibility-heavy roles, rotating panels where judges share experiences of being mistaken, undermined, or ignored. He skimmed the first page, then looked up. You've thought this through. Angela offered a soft reply. I've lived it through. By month's end, 3 recommendations had been adopted in full. 2 more were under review. And something subtle shifted, not just in the halls of that courthouse, but in how the institution understood dignity. A clerk emailed her privately. I never realized how much I assumed. I always thought of myself as fair. A young female security trainee asked if she could shadow Angela's courtroom. I want to learn how to command space without raising my voice. Even the guard who had stopped her that morning, he sent a typed letter. Not handwritten, not dramatic, but honest. It included this line. You didn't humiliate me. My assumptions did. I won't let them speak before I do again. Angela didn't reply. She didn't need to. It wasn't about closure. It was about design. 3 months later, Angela was asked to speak at a judicial ethics seminar. The topic was unconscious bias in authority spaces. She titled her presentation, When Authority is Misread. She didn't mention herself, not directly, but the story was there, in every slide that showed statistics, in every example drawn, from real-life incidents, in every silence she allowed to hang between points, giving the audience time to feel what the numbers couldn't say aloud. At the end, someone raised a hand. Judge Morris. What do you say to people who mean well but still get it wrong? Angela answered without delay. I say, meaning well is a good beginning. But if we're going to guard justice, then our intentions have to mature into standards, not apologies. She left the room in silence, her words trailing behind her, not as noise, but as architecture. Later that year, the courthouse published its first public equity accountability report. Angela read it in her office. There, in the executive summary, was a phrase that startled her, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so plainly written. We acknowledge that assumptions are often more powerful than protocols, and we are addressing that imbalance. She circled the sentence in blue ink. It was the kind of line that didn't change the world, but it changed the building. On her desk was a small folder she kept closed most days. It wasn't legal. It wasn't professional. It was personal. Inside were notes, scans, letters, news clippings, margins of silence where hurt had once lived. She titled it quietly, "What Almost Made Me Stop Believing." And at the back, slipped between two pieces of paper, was a sticky note from a visiting judge who had heard about what happened. Just 6 words, but carefully chosen. "You stood still. We followed better." Angela closed the folder, turned off her desk lamp, and stepped out of her chambers. The hallway was empty, but the light stayed on, because what she had built wasn't a moment. It was a path. Angela Morris did not burn bridges. She redesigned the path so others wouldn't fall through it. The courthouse lobby no longer startled her, not because the building had changed overnight, but because it had started learning how to see. Not everything, not yet, but enough. Enough to pause before assuming, enough to hesitate before excluding, enough to recognize that sometimes dignity enters a room before credentials. Months after the incident, she stood by the same security gate where she'd once been, stopped. Same tiled floor, same camera overhead, different officers. One of them nodded as she approached. "Good morning, Judge." It was quiet, unforced. Angela nodded back, not because she needed validation, but because the gesture was part of the architecture now. It wasn't personal. It was procedural. She remembered the first time she'd been mistaken for someone lesser. It wasn't even in a courthouse. It was in a law library, first year of school. A professor had assumed she was a student aide. She had corrected him softly. He'd laughed and said, "You've got presence, just not a lawyer's face." She had gone home and stared into the mirror that night, wondering what a lawyer's face looked like. Now she had one, not because her face had changed, but because people had learned how to see it differently. A colleague once asked her, "Why didn't you file a formal complaint that morning?" Angela had paused before answering. "Because a complaint is about punishment. I wanted a pattern." The colleague didn't understand at first, but eventually they did. Because justice isn't always found in headlines. Sometimes it's in the shift of a protocol, in the training manual quietly rewritten, in the line added to the annual review. "Do you see leadership when it doesn't look like you?" Angela believed in policy, but she also believed in memory. Memory makes you better. Memory teaches you not to look away next time, not to laugh too soon, not to speak for someone before they've been allowed to enter the room. She wanted the courthouse to remember, not her name, not her robe, not even the mistake, but the moment where a system paused long enough to hear itself breathe. One afternoon, a young attorney, a black woman, maybe 28, waited for Angela after court. She had sat through proceedings silently, notebook in hand. Now, she approached slowly, as though testing the weight of the space between them. "I heard what happened," she said. Angela gave her a curious look. "Which part?" The woman smiled, nervous. "All of it. The checkpoint, the letter, the policy draft, the seminar." Angela didn't answer right away. "I didn't do it for visibility," she said. "I did it so next time someone like you isn't asked who they're here to see." The woman nodded. "Thank you for not shrinking." Angela met her eyes. "I thought about it." That confession hung there, soft, real. And then Angela added, "But every time I wanted to shrink, I remembered who was watching." Justice, Angela believed, was not a statue holding scales. It was the decision to keep walking through a door even after someone told you not to. It was the look in a colleague's eye after they've stopped seeing you as exceptional and started seeing you as expected. It was in the moment after a mistake, when someone chooses to change, not to cover it up. She never wanted to be famous. She wanted to be followed, not for attention, but for correction. She stood by the window in her chambers one evening, courthouse emptying out, the light a little softer than usual. In her drawer was a stack of thank you notes she hadn't read in months. Most were from strangers, some from guards, others from law students, all of them different, and yet all saying the same thing in their own way. You made us think. You made us pause. You made us better. She didn't need applause, just accountability. Because real justice doesn't just correct the guilty, it corrects the system that lets guilt hide in plain sight. And real legacy, it's not what they call you after you leave the room. It's how the room moves differently when you're no longer there. Angela Morris left her chambers that night in silence. But the air didn't forget her, and neither will the system that learned, finally, how to see.